on the battlefield? What does my status yield in this society? Will it gain me notoriety, or will they lie to me?
The Civil War was a pageantry of so many extreme emotions and passions. It was, in many people's view, the defining moment of what it is to be an American. For many of us in Minnesota, there's a sense that that was an experience that really wasn't a part of me. And so I find that the stories of those who hadn't had a voice in the past to be compelling and probably more relevant to most people who don't feel like they have a voice.
We are the sons of freedom.
Rather than being seen as passive participants in their own history, now scholars are starting to really portray these African Americans as very active and dynamic participants who move their status forward through distinct action, including sacrificing their own lives on the battlefield.
The stories of how black men in Minnesota came to wear the Union blue speaks to the meaning of service to a nation that didn't always serve you.
Of the hard-to-find history of marginalized communities and the ways history connects us all.
These are some of the Civil War stories of Minnesota's black pioneers. We are the sons of freedom.
North Star Civil War Stories is a TPT Partnerships co-production with the Ramsey County Historical Society and Twin Cities PBS.
We are the sons of freedom.
This program was made possible by funds provided by the state of Minnesota through the Minnesota Historical Society from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
At the onset of the Civil War, black men weren't seen as having the character, courage, or capability to fight for their freedom.
The Union Army generals and the politicians' original stance on black participation in the Civil War was to bar it.
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation set the stage for African Americans to join segregated units. But why risk it when the war was well underway?
It makes sense, therefore, for African American men who weren't expected to fight to just sit back and let it happen. And I think a lot of society expected blacks to sit back. It became critical for African Americans precisely for that bias that they knew existed in society, that it wasn't just an issue of becoming free. So when an African American signed up to fight, what he was doing was laying the groundwork for a future that he hoped would be governed by dignity and respect.
The Brooklyn Township Historical Society created a detailed chronicle of the residents from the suburban community who fought in the Civil War.
The list is titled Roll of Honor, List of the Patriots of Brooklyn who enlisted for the suppression of the Great Slaveholders Rebellion. They didn't call it secession. It wasn't a civil war. It was a rebellion of the slaveholders. I came to this soldier named Stephen Dutton, and when I went to look to see what regiment he was in, it said 57th Colored Infantry. That really grabbed me. We do know that he was a slave in Alabama. He escaped. Somehow he was able to make his way up to Minnesota. He received a town bond for $225, or in other words, a bounty, to enlist with Brooklyn Township as his home.
Late in the war, with casualties mounting, it was hard to find men to enlist. So to avoid a draft, communities would offer a bounty to volunteers.
Because he was willing to enlist, towns were fighting for him and they were actually bidding for him. And he actually took a lesser amount because a soldier from Brooklyn Township, his name was Thomas Green, with the 3rd Minnesota Infantry Regiment. And in '64, he became an officer in a colored regiment. And he enticed Stephen Dutton to enlist from Brooklyn Township and be a part of his 57th U.S. Colored Troop. So that was the connection of Stephen Dutton to Brooklyn Township.
Offered up a bounty for the volunteers. Only way to be a patriot was be a pioneer.
So the 57th U.S. Colored Infantry was stationed in Arkansas, mostly in Little Rock. For the most part, they were on guard and garrison duty. although they did fight in a few skirmishes. So we know that he came back to Minnesota in 1865.
With his army pay and his bounty, Dutton bought land and was listed in the 1870 census as the only African-American farmer in Minneapolis. The Black veteran would see himself reflected in the diverse community Old Brooklyn Township has become.
Well, we have a large Liberian population in Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park. And of course, the reason why they're here today is because of the Civil War in Liberia. And it was very important for me to get these books into the schoolrooms, into the classrooms.
Despite his continued research, Daryl Sanders has not yet found Dutton's final resting place.
So he's in an unmarked grave somewhere, and I've been looking for him for 10 years.
Well, it'd be wonderful, of course, if we had diaries and memoirs and other kind of documents of those 100+ Black men who had participated in the Civil War and who were Minnesotans or who ended up in Minnesota.
Without a grave marker or personal accounts, Dutton at least now has an honor for his service inspired by the American Revolution.
So they thought that anyone who was going to fight to preserve the Union should be again called a patriot.
This land in Stearns County, Minnesota, has been in the same family since the 1850s. This place symbolizes the story of immigration and building the American dream, but it's also a part of Minnesota's Black Civil War story.
Herman Schaefers is my great-grandfather who had immigrated from Hagensdorf, Germany in 1855 with his family. He got drafted for the Civil War, and so he ended up walking from Roscoe, Minnesota to Fort Snelling to sign up, and that's over 100 miles.
Both the North and the South allowed men who were drafted to hire substitutes to serve for them.
Family story was that Herman was at Fort Snelling and that an African-American young man came up to him and said, "I'll go in your place." The other part of the story was that this young gentleman ended up dying in the war.
I ended up at the Historical Society and I told them the story, and the person there said, well, we can just pull the muster records. And I start paging through the ledger and see finally an entry, Dixon William, and that he went as a substitute for Herman Schaefers. And this was just incredibly moving because it went from this story to a person. We knew that he was from Tennessee. We know that he was 5'4".
18 years old.
18 years old. That he was mixed race, he was mulatto, was listed on it. So it became this person.
At this point, the Schaefers haven't found any photos of William Dixon. But the more they lift him up and say his name, the more Dixon gets back his own agency, humanity, and manhood.
His willingness, his bravery in going south down that river, we just empathized with him and we cared about him. We wanted his story to be remembered.
You peel back the onion and there's more questions that come out than answers.
Right. The only thing we know is those 9 months.
When Dred Scott was here, he was Dr. Emerson's slave. And so
Alicia Vellante is a scholar and historian with an interest in equity and social justice. Kate read an article of Alicia's and reached out to share her story of William Dixon.
So what was your thoughts?
Somehow William Dixon is here at the fort offering to volunteer for someone.
Somewhere on these historic grounds, Herman and William connected and struck a deal with a down payment. Schaefers kept his word and sent Dixon the rest of the money, but the young soldier never got a chance to use it and start a new life. He was deployed downriver to Louisiana where, like so many soldiers in the Civil War, he died of disease.
Most of the time he was in the service, he suffered, and so that breaks my heart.
And that's the story of most people who fought in the Civil War. Most of their deaths were the way that William Dixon passed away. Great-grandfather felt that it was important enough to keep telling that story.
Yes. I think when you look at the life he built. He worked hard his whole life.
Yeah.
He kept that farm together to give to his children. So the family through the generations has kept that farm dear to us.
Everything that farm seems to represent is all about life.
Yes.
Yes.
It's all about sustainability. It's all about love,
Yeah.
you know, and it's all about family. And I think, like, what a beautiful legacy.
I think, especially for our kids, there is a new appreciation for what William Dixon meant to our family and just kind of understanding where they came from.
While the farm is a living legacy of this immigrant and this African American, Dixon is also recognized at the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. While in D.C., Kate visited the site and shared the story of her family's connection to Dixon with a museum staffer who was so moved that he suggested she come back to the museum to do a descendants lecture.
I'm not a descendant, but yet my family benefited from this man's decision to go in Herman's place. And so to be even invited to do a descendant speech, it felt like incredible irony, but also an honor.
So that gets to your question, do we feel like he's a part of our family? Yeah.
From Europeans to Southeast Asians and Africans, many have come to Minnesota because of the disruption and dislocation caused by war. African Americans share a part of this refugee experience.
There is an African American refugee history that's associated with many different events. If you rewind back, that was true for those folks who were part of Minnesota's history in the 1850s and 1860s.
From the plantation, and there's a clash waiting, you can see the flags waving. But blacks on the move during the Civil War weren't called refugees. Instead, a curious word was added to America's racial lexicon.
Contraband basically means the slave who left the plantation. General Benjamin Butler coined the term contraband.
General Ben Butler said, these people are contraband of war. They are no different in a sense than the mules, than the horses, than anything else that we capture from the enemy. They are contraband of war being used for war purposes.
Contraband tended to dehumanize blacks, but that was the language of the middle years of the Civil War because there were a number of slave-owning states that had not seceded. And so the federal government was constantly walking a tightrope in fighting this war without alienating a lot of potential Southern allies who wanted to keep their slaves.
In fact, this tightrope walking meant Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all of those in bondage.
The Emancipation Proclamation only included those states that were still in open rebellion against the Union.
The 13th Amendment would free all enslaved blacks, but those in border states like Missouri weren't waiting and set out to find their freedom. Some of these contraband were brought to Minnesota to work as teamsters during the Dakota War.
And so General Henry Hastings Sibley, our first governor, looks to St. Louis. Can you send us some teamsters? And, well, what about contraband teamsters?
The black teamsters met a military recruiter from Iowa.
A man named Alexander Clark came up here to Fort Snelling to recruit. He knew that all these guys were coming back. So Clark recruited 30-some of these ex-teamsters to go with him down to Keokuk, Iowa, to join what became known as the 60th United States Colored Infantry. At that time, it was the 1st Regiment, Iowa Infantry of African descent. Here you have this Iowa unit that's African American, and almost half the guys say that they are from Fort Snelling, Minnesota.
We are the sons of freedom.
Their job in Helena, Arkansas, was to protect a series of federal plantations. At one point, there was word received that a force of Confederate cavalry was coming in to raid the plantations. So an expedition of these African American troops, infantry and artillery, was sent out toward Big Creek, Arkansas. They were attacked on all four sides by Confederates. They were trapped. They fought for pretty much a whole day, and finally a force of cavalry came to their rescue, and they managed to get away. They held their own. They proved their worth as soldiers in their very first battle.
Among the soldiers fighting with the 60th United States Colored Infantry was Henry Howard.
He was one of the young men who escaped from slavery, was brought up to St. Louis, was sent up to Fort Snelling, joins the Army, down to St. Louis, survives the disease down there, down to Helena, survives the disease, and is killed in action in Arkansas. Quite a story.
The defining moment to sacrifice your life is by
we transformed ourselves to a higher purpose. What is it about the notion of sacrifice that compel people to put their lives on the line? I find the Civil War is compelling because it gives us that window into the human nature of traumatic time.
Pay them homage, they responded for respect and dignity.
The African-American soldiers of the 39th U.S. Colored Infantry presented this saber to their Colonel Azora Stearns of Olmsted County, Minnesota. He was one of many white Minnesotans who became officers in black regiments.
Sometimes African Americans would develop close ties with their officers, so that when their officers had finished their tours of duty, the African Americans would follow them back to their homes.
Among the black veterans to migrate to Minnesota after the war was Dakota County's George Daniels. He served with William LeDuc from Hastings, Minnesota. This carriage house on the historic LeDuc estate is where George Daniels called home as he started his post-war life in Minnesota, and where he is still celebrated as a pioneer of Dakota County. Another celebrated black Civil War veteran is Litchfield's lamplighter, A. Van Spence.
He was born in 1837 in Alabama, and he was a slave. And during the Civil War, he was forced to fight for the Confederacy, and he deserted and joined the Union Army.
Lieutenant Frank Daggett was a draw for Van Spence to make his home in Meeker County. Daggett was also an early member of the Grand Army of the Republic, the major veterans group for the Union soldiers. This GAR post in Litchfield, Minnesota is named for Daggett.
Every small town had their own GAR post, and at a number of these posts, they had African American members who were accepted into full membership, which is really unusual in the time period. When you think of most social institutions, there were racial divides, but yet the Grand Army of the Republic was, generally speaking, open to participation by any true veteran of that conflict.
If I didn't believe that this African American was equal, he looks equal once he puts on that uniform.
He was a great musician. He played several instruments. He used to entertain here at the hall. He was married. He had 6 children. He named that son Frank Daggett after Frank Daggett. He had a son who was the ball boy for the championship football team in 1900, and that son went on to be a firefighter down in Minneapolis. He was a custodian at the courthouse. He was the lamplighter. They were actually kerosene, so he had to go and light them, and then he had to go and put them out when it was time to go put them out. And I've read stories that he always carried candy with him in his pockets, and he'd give the children candy. They'd follow him around.
He had to fight to get paid for the work he did lighting the lamps. There were certain councilmen at the time that didn't want to pay him, but the community overwhelmingly forced them to pay. The ledgers talk about Mr. Van Spence being the person who did all of these fundraisers to help build this hall. He was so proud of this place that he would do anything, and also to raise funds for the relief of veterans and their widows. Here's where they talk about that Albert put on a fine barbecue and raised, $80. And we even have a picture of him doing his barbecue.
This is really neat, yeah.
Van Spence was involved in the Afro-American League, which gathered in Minnesota in 1891. His and other Civil War veterans' service was cited as central to this early civil rights movement, declaring, We are citizens of the great state of Minnesota. In war and peace, in avenues of industry, on the fields of carnage, we have done our duty. Although slavery has been abolished, we are thoroughly convinced that it is absolutely necessary for the preservation of our sacred rights as citizens, that we place ourselves in such a position to arouse the conscience of the entire people. Van Spence died in Minneapolis in 1910. He was brought back to Litchfield to be buried in the community that would continue to honor him.
He fought for his freedom. He fought in the war. He came here. He continued to fight for the rights of veterans and their families. A great part of this community.
We see why these histories are important. They are not divisive. They actually do the opposite. They bring people together.
Cemeteries are an art gallery and a place of faith, a space for family and history. In Minnesota, African American Civil War stories can be found in these common grounds.
We were here looking for the marker of green chambers, and after a bit of work, we found it. Colored troops, yep. USCT. Yep, there you go. All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Green Chambers served in the 115th U.S. Colored Troops. He came with a company officer back to Minnesota. He went to Anoka, Minnesota. With the money that he had earned from his Civil War pay, bought a farm in Blaine Township and farmed there for the rest of his life and became a very prominent citizen.
40 miles south of St. Paul, another researcher became an accidental scholar of the state's Black Civil War story. Jeff Suve was on a walk with his wife when he noticed a headstone that had been overgrown by a tree. His wife crawled under the branches and read the name on the marker.
And she said, "It says John Boone." And I just couldn't believe it. And it was just like this incredibly emotional moment because his wife is buried on the other side of the cemetery, and here John was.
The archivist's further research revealed that John, Missouri, and some of their extended family were free blacks from North Carolina who found their way to central Minnesota.
And established really one of the first African-American settlements in the territory of Minnesota.
The idea of the frontier, a movement into a freer world of possibility, that clearly was part of the process of thinking for so many early African Americans who came to this state, in some cases again before the Civil War.
And a high proportion of them, I believe about 80% of African American men enlist to fight in the Civil War. Off he goes, leaving Missouri behind. She took it upon herself to come to Northfield in January of 1865.
While Missouri settled into the small town, John was assigned to a Missouri-colored troop regiment.
He was sent to the Missouri 18th. They had battles eventually at Nashville, Chattanooga, so he was seasoned. John actually made corporal, so, he was held up with some esteem.
The Boone's daughter, Mittie, moved to Minneapolis for more opportunities. She became the first Black woman to hold the position of Registrar of Deeds at Hennepin County. She married Matt Cannon. Their son Raymond fought in World War I, following his grandfather's example of leading through service and then serving through leadership.
Oftentimes, if you think about it, the people who fought in the war were African Americans who were of some standing, or if they were not, they certainly used the opportunity to now catapult themselves into middle-class society. So they would become professionals, whether it be doctors or lawyers. That was the great gateway for African Americans to sort of get ahead, was to serve this country.
Raymond Cannon, whose story connects Northfield to the south side of Minneapolis, was a strident voice for equity in the military, urging the desegregation of the armed forces that wouldn't come until after World War II. He would appreciate the idea of cemeteries being common ground for soldiers.
So they faced segregation their whole lifetime. They faced slavery. But even though there was segregation in the military until after World War II, here in the cemetery, all the soldiers are buried together. So you have African American and white soldiers buried alongside each other. There's still many stories out there waiting to be discovered. So we really need to do a lot more research on who these men were.
The pageantry of these extreme emotions, the